What if I told you that beneath the cities we know today lie the bones of civilizations that vanished overnight? Not through war, not through plague, but through something far more absolute. Water, the great eraser, the silent destroyer that leaves no monuments, no records, only whispers in the sediment and stories passed down through generations who barely understood what they had witnessed. Tonight, as the world settles into sleep, we're going to walk through the ruins of cities that time forgot. Cities where children played in streets that are now buried under 20 feet of mud. Where libraries held scrolls that dissolved in torrents no human engineering could contain. Where entire ways of life were simply washed away. Picture this. You're standing in what was once the greatest city of its time. Markets buzz with trade from distant lands. Engineers channel rivers through sophisticated drainage systems that won't be matched for centuries. Artisans create works of beauty that speak to gods whose names we've forgotten. Then, in a single day, sometimes in a single hour, it's all gone. The water comes, and's nothing left but silenced when it recedes there. This isn't speculation. This isn't myth. The earth itself remembers. In layers of clay and silt, in the scattered stones of foundations, in the desperate final works of people who knew the end was coming. Archaeological sites across the world tell the same haunting story. Civilizations that thrived for centuries, erased so completely that we're only now beginning to understand they ever existed at all. The ancients knew something we're just remembering. They built their myths around floods because floods were the one force that could truly end everything. Fire leaves ash, war leaves ruins, plague leaves bodies. But floods leave nothing. They scatter, they bury, they carry away every trace until even memory becomes legend, and legend becomes myth. From the fertile crescents of Mesopotamia to the sophisticated cities of the Indus Valley, from the volcanic shores of the Mediterranean to the storm-battered coasts of China, we're going to trace the stories of places that were here one day and gone the next. Cities whose names we barely know, whose people left no descendants to remember them, whose only monuments are the layers of flood sediment that archaeologists dig through with careful hands and heavy hearts. What makes these stories so haunting isn't just the scale of destruction. It's the humanity we find in the details. The ceramic pot left on a windowsill as someone fled. The children's toys buried in silt. The desperate attempts to build walls higher, to dig channels deeper, to somehow hold back forces that dwarf our understanding even today. Tonight, we'll discover how the greatest natural disaster in American history wasn't an earthquake or a hurricane alone, but the storm surge that turned an entire city into a tomb. We'll walk through the streets of Pompeii and Herculaneum, where people were preserved in their final moments by the very forces that destroyed them. We'll dive beneath the Black Sea to find evidence of a flood so catastrophic it may have inspired the story of Noah himself. But this isn't just about ancient history. These floods reveal something profound about the fragility of civilization itself, about how quickly our greatest achievements can become archaeological puzzles, about how the forces of nature don't negotiate with human ambition, no matter how grand or seemingly permanent our cities appear. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. Across continents and across millennia, the pattern repeats. Layers of careful human construction suddenly interrupted by deposits of clay, silt, and debris. The geological signature of catastrophe, the moment when human time collides with the deeper rhythms of the planet itself. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, archaeologists have found flood layers that tell of waters rising beyond anything the sophisticated drainage systems could handle. At sites like Shurapak and Kish, they've uncovered deposits of sand and clay that separate entire eras of human development. 60 centimeters of flood sediment that represents the end of one world and the desperate beginning of another. These aren't gentle seasonal floods. These are markers of catastrophe, evidence of waters that rose so high, moved so fast, carried so much debris that they buried entire districts under meters of mud. When archaeologists dig through these layers, they find the scattered remains of a civilization interrupted. Broken pottery mixed with flood debris. The foundations of buildings that were simply overwhelmed. The people who lived through these floods, the ones who survived to rebuild, they knew they had witnessed something beyond ordinary disaster. Their stories became the flood myths that echo through every culture on Earth. Because when you've seen water erase everything you knew, when you've watched centuries of human achievement disappear in hours, you don't forget. You tell stories. You build those stories into the foundations of your new world, hoping future generations will understand the power of what they're living alongside. But perhaps nowhere is this story more dramatically preserved than in the Black Sea, where recent discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of how quickly human civilization can be rewritten by rising waters. Here, beneath hundreds of feet of water, lie the remains of what may have been one of the most significant disasters in human history. A flood so catastrophic, so sudden, so complete in its destruction that it may have sent waves of refugees across Europe and Asia, carrying with them the traumatic memory of a homeland swallowed by the sea. The evidence is remarkable. Ancient shorelines preserved on the sea floor, the remnants of freshwater species that died when salt water rushed in, Stone Age structures and tools lying exactly where they were dropped by people who had to choose between their possessions and their lives. The archaeology of panic, preserved in sediment. World-famous underwater archaeologist Robert Ballard, the same man who found the Titanic, has spent years exploring these submerged landscapes. What he's found challenges our understanding of how quickly civilization can change. Structures that were built on dry land, inhabited by thriving communities, suddenly buried under hundreds of feet of water, not gradually, over generations, but rapidly enough that people had to abandon their homes with almost no warning. The theory is staggering in its implications. As glaciers melted at the end of the last ice age, meltwater from European rivers began flowing north into the North Sea instead of feeding the Black Sea. The Black Sea began to shrink, its level dropping, its waters becoming less salty. Communities built along its shores, developed agriculture, created the kind of settled civilization that archaeologists are only now beginning to understand. Then, in what may have been a matter of days or weeks, the Mediterranean broke through. A catastrophic breach that sent seawater pouring into the Black Sea basin with unimaginable force. The water level rose by hundreds of feet. 150,000 square kilometers of inhabited land disappeared beneath the waves. Entire civilizations, complete with their languages, their technologies, their ways of life, simply vanished. The survivors of this disaster didn't just disappear, they scattered. They carried their trauma and their fragments of lost knowledge across Europe and Asia. Archaeologists have found evidence of their migrations in the sudden appearance of new cultures, new technologies, new genetic markers in places as distant as Egypt and the foothills of the Himalayas. The diaspora of a drowned world, spreading their stories and their skills wherever they could find refuge. What makes this discovery so profound is how it connects the archaeological evidence with the mythological record. The flood stories that appear in cultures across the globe may not be independent inventions. They may be cultural memories of actual events, passed down through generations of refugees who never forgot the homeland beneath the waves. This is where archaeology becomes detective work of the deepest kind. Researchers are now tracing the spread of Indo-European languages, the sudden appearance of agricultural techniques, the distribution of pottery styles and burial customs, all potentially linked to this ancient disaster. The flood that destroyed the Black Sea communities may have been one of the great formative events in human history, shaping the development of cultures across two continents. But the Black Sea disaster, as massive as it was, represents just one type of flood catastrophe that has shaped human civilization. Equally devastating, but entirely different in character, are the floods that result from the failure of natural dams. When lakes held back by ice, or debris, or geological formations suddenly break free, the results can reshape entire landscapes in matters of hours. The archaeological evidence for these mega-floods is written into the geology of continents. In North America, the channeled scablands of Washington state tell the story of floods so massive they carved canyons through solid rock. When glacial Lake Missoula broke free from its ice dam, it released a volume of water equal to the combined flow of every river on Earth. The floods scoured the landscape down to bedrock, carried boulders the size of houses hundreds of miles, and left behind a terrain so alien that early geologists couldn't believe it was caused by water at all. These weren't gradual processes. These were catastrophes that transformed the face of the Earth in days. And if such floods could carve through solid basalt, what would they do to human settlements? What cities? What civilizations? What entire cultures might have been swept away by forces that left no trace except in the strange geology of distant river valleys? The answer may lie in the scattered evidence of human habitation that archaeologists are finding in the most unlikely places. Stone tools in flood deposits, fragments of pottery mixed with glacial debris, the traces of people who were in the wrong place when the Earth decided to rearrange itself. In China, the archaeological record tells a different but equally dramatic story. The ancient city of Kaifeng, once one of the largest cities in the world and the imperial capital of several Chinese dynasties, has been destroyed by floods more than 40 times in its 3,000-year history. But one flood stands out from all the others. In 1642 AD, the Yellow River broke through Kaifeng's defences with such force that it killed an estimated 300,000 people and buried the city under meters of mud and debris. What makes Kaifeng's destruction so archaeologically significant is how completely it was preserved. The city walls, which should have protected the inhabitants, instead trapped the floodwaters inside the city. The result was a catastrophe so complete that entire districts were buried intact, creating a 20-meter-thick archaeological sequence that tells the story of a city that literally drowned. Excavations at Kaifeng have revealed something haunting about how quickly advanced civilizations can become archaeological sites. Streets that once bustled with merchants and scholars are now buried corridors that archaeologists navigate with headlamps. The sophisticated drainage systems that should have saved the city instead became death traps, channeling water into areas where families had no escape. Layer upon layer of flood sediment mixed with the debris of daily life. Broken roof tiles, scattered coins, the remnants of silk that dissolved in the churning waters. What the Kaifeng discoveries show us is that even cities designed to withstand floods, even civilizations with thousands of years of experience managing river systems, can be overwhelmed when nature decides the rules have changed. The Yellow River had flooded before. The people of Kaifeng knew floods. They had built walls, dug channels, created early warning systems. None of it mattered when the water came with the force of geological time compressed into human hours. The preservation at Kaifeng is so complete that archaeologists can trace the final moments of neighborhoods. They've found evidence of people trying to escape to higher floors as water filled the lower levels of their homes. Ceramic vessels still contain the grain that families were storing when the flood began. Tools lie where they were dropped by craftsmen who realized their workshops were about to become tombs. But perhaps most haunting are the signs of preparation and hope. The archaeological layers show that after previous floods, the people of Kaifeng had raised the level of their city, building new foundations on top of the old. They were fighting a war against water with engineering and determination. For generations they won, until the day they didn't. Moving westward across ancient trade routes, we encounter a different type of catastrophe entirely. In the Mediterranean, the archaeological record speaks of disasters that combined the fury of the earth with the power of the sea. The Bronze Age eruption of Thera, modern-day Santorini, created one of the most perfectly preserved archaeological disasters in human history. The island of Thera was home to a sophisticated Minoan settlement at Akrotiri. Multi-story buildings decorated with frescoes that rival anything from ancient Egypt. Advanced plumbing systems that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for over 1,000 years. A thriving port that connected the Aegean world with Africa and Asia. Then, around 1600 BC, the volcano that formed their island decided to reshape itself. The eruption was cataclysmic beyond modern comprehension. The explosion sent an ash cloud 35 kilometers into the atmosphere. The sound could be heard across the eastern Mediterranean, but it was what happened next that turned a volcanic disaster into an archaeological treasure trove and a human tragedy of unprecedented scale. When the volcanic columns collapsed back into the sea, they generated tsunamis that raced across the Mediterranean at the speed of jet aircraft. Waves 35 meters high struck the northern coast of Crete. The sophisticated Minoan palaces, with their elaborate frescoes and complex drainage systems, were smashed to fragments in minutes. At Pallaicastro, archaeologists have found a layer of destruction that tells the story in clay tablets, broken pottery, and human bones, all mixed together in the chaos of tsunami debris. The Akrotiri settlement on Thera itself was preserved in volcanic ash like a Bronze Age Pompeii. But here's what makes the archaeological evidence so eerie. They found almost no human remains. The people of Akrotiri knew what was coming. The preliminary earthquakes, the ash falls, the warning signs that their sophisticated culture had learned to read. They evacuated. They took their valuables, their sacred objects, even their household goods. What they left behind was a ghost town, perfectly preserved, waiting for archaeologists to discover it 3,500 years later. But evacuation from Thera didn't mean survival. The tsunamis that followed the eruption travelled faster than any Bronze Age ship. The archaeological evidence from Crete shows that many of the coastal settlements were destroyed so completely that they were never rebuilt. The Minoan civilization, one of the most advanced cultures of its time, began a decline from which it never recovered. Within 50 years, the palaces were abandoned. The linear A script was forgotten. An entire way of life simply ended. What makes the Thera disaster so archaeologically significant is how it demonstrates the interconnectedness of ancient civilizations. The ash from the eruption has been found in archaeological layers across the eastern Mediterranean, from Turkey to Israel. The tsunami deposits appear in coastal sites hundreds of miles from the volcano. This wasn't a local disaster. This was a catastrophe that reset the entire region's development. But volcanic disasters, as devastating as they can be, represent just one way that ancient cities could be erased from history. Sometimes the destroyer came not from below the earth, but from above. The archaeological record of Pompeii and Herculaneum tells a different story of preservation and destruction, where the very forces that killed an entire population also created one of the most complete archaeological records of ancient urban life ever discovered. On August 24th, 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius had been dormant for so long that many residents of the surrounding cities didn't even realize they were living next to an active volcano. The fertile slopes were covered with vineyards and farms. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were thriving centers of Roman commerce and culture. The wealthy built elaborate villas with gardens and fountains. The middle classes operated shops and workshops. Slaves and freedmen worked in industries that served the entire Bay of Naples. The eruption began at noon with a column of ash and pumice that rose 10 miles into the atmosphere. For the people of Pompeii, the initial hours were survivable. Ash and small pumice stones fell like deadly snow, but many residents took shelter in their homes, waiting for the eruption to end. Archaeological evidence shows that some people tried to escape the city as the ash accumulated, but others remained, perhaps believing their stone buildings would protect them. What the archaeological record reveals is that the real killer wasn't the falling ash, but what came next. Pyroclastic flows, superheated clouds of gas and volcanic debris, raced down the mountain at over 100 miles per hour. When these flows reached Pompeii, they didn't just kill the remaining inhabitants instantly. They preserved them. The heat was so intense that it vaporized organic matter while leaving bone and the shapes of bodies intact. But it was the ash that followed that created the archaeological miracle. The fine volcanic debris settled around the victims, forming perfect molds of their final moments. Families huddled together in cellars, individuals caught trying to flee, dogs still chained to their posts, gladiators in their barracks, an entire city frozen in time. At Herculaneum, the story was different but equally tragic. The city was farther from the initial ashfall, and many residents initially escaped. But when the pyroclastic flows reached the city, they found hundreds of people gathered in boathouses by the ancient seashore, hoping for rescue by sea. The archaeological evidence shows they died together, overwhelmed by heat so intense that their bodies were vaporized instantly, leaving only their skeletons arranged exactly as they had been in their final moments. What makes Pompeii and Herculaneum so archaeologically valuable is that they represent complete urban environments preserved at a single moment in time. We can read the graffiti on the walls. We can see what people were cooking for dinner. We can trace the water systems, the businesses, the social hierarchies. We can even read the scrolls in private libraries, carbonized but preserved by the same heat that killed their owners. But the preservation also tells us something profound about the fragility of urban life. These weren't primitive settlements. They were sophisticated cities with advanced engineering, complex economies, and connections to the far reaches of the Roman Empire. Yet all of it was erased in a matter of hours. The archaeological layers show no gradual decline, no slow abandonment, just the sudden transition from living city to geological deposit. The volcanic disasters of the ancient world demonstrate how quickly natural forces can turn thriving civilizations into archaeological sites. But as we move from the Mediterranean to the edges of recorded history, we encounter flood disasters that challenge our understanding of how advanced ancient civilizations could be, and how completely they could disappear. In the Indus Valley, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of cities that were more sophisticated than anything in Europe or the Middle East at the same time period. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had sewage systems that wouldn't be matched until Roman times. Their cities were laid out on precise grids. They had standardized weights and measures. They developed a writing system that we still haven't deciphered. Yet by 1800 BC, these magnificent cities were abandoned. The archaeological evidence points to a complex disaster involving both climate change and catastrophic flooding. As monsoon patterns shifted, the rivers that fed the Indus Valley civilization became unreliable, but the final blow came from floods so severe that they overwhelmed even the sophisticated drainage systems these people had built. At Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists have found evidence of desperate attempts to raise the city level above rising floodwaters. Massive embankments 70 feet wide were built to hold back the rivers. Buildings were repeatedly rebuilt on higher foundations. The archaeological layers show a civilization fighting for its survival against waters that kept rising higher than their defenses could reach. The flood deposits at Mohenjo-Daro tell a story of engineering triumph turned into archaeological tragedy. The same sophisticated drainage systems that made the city possible became traps when the water rose faster than they could channel it away. Streets became rivers, houses became islands. Eventually, even islands weren't enough. What makes the Indus Valley floods so significant archaeologically is how they demonstrate the limits of ancient technology. These weren't primitive people overwhelmed by forces they couldn't understand. These were sophisticated engineers who understood hydraulics, who had successfully managed river systems for centuries. Yet when the climate changed and the floods came with unprecedented force, all their knowledge and skill couldn't save their cities. The abandonment was so complete that the Indus Valley script was forgotten. The cities were buried under silt and sand. For over 3,000 years, one of the world's most advanced ancient civilizations existed only in the archaeological record, waiting for modern excavations to reveal the scope of what had been lost. As we trace these flood disasters across continents and millennia, a pattern emerges that challenges our assumptions about the permanence of human achievement. From the Black Sea to the Indus Valley, from the Mediterranean to ancient China, the archaeological record tells the same story. Sophisticated civilizations, advanced technologies, complex urban societies, all erased by waters that rose faster than human engineering could contain them. The sediment layers don't lie. The flood deposits don't exaggerate. The scattered artifacts and disrupted building foundations speak of disasters so complete that entire ways of life simply ended. Not gradually, not through conquest or decline, but suddenly, absolutely, finally. These ancient flood disasters reveal something unsettling about the relationship between human ambition and natural force. The archaeological evidence shows that the most advanced civilizations of their time, the ones with the most sophisticated engineering and the deepest understanding of their environments, were often the most completely erased when the waters finally came. But it's in the more recent archaeological record that we find perhaps the most haunting example of how quickly modern civilization can become ancient ruin. On November 1st, 1755, the city of Lisbon was one of Europe's greatest ports. Portuguese ships brought wealth from across the globe to its harbours. The city's libraries held manuscripts from civilizations that spanned continents. Its architecture represented centuries of cultural achievement, blending influences from Africa, Asia, and the Americas into something uniquely magnificent. At 9:20 in the morning, the earth beneath Lisbon began to shake. The earthquake lasted between 3 and 6 minutes, but those minutes changed everything. Fissures 5 meters wide opened in the city centre. Buildings that had stood for centuries collapsed in moments. But the earthquake was just the beginning. Survivors rushed toward the harbour, thinking the open space near the water would be safer than the collapsing buildings. They had no way of knowing that they were running directly toward the greatest danger. 40 minutes after the earthquake, a wall of water 20 feet high struck the harbour with the force of accumulated ocean. The tsunami swept inland, carrying ships, debris, and thousands of people into the heart of the city. The archaeological evidence of Lisbon's destruction tells a story that unfolds in distinct layers of catastrophe. First, the earthquake debris, the scattered stones and broken timber of buildings that couldn't withstand the shaking. Then, mixed with that debris, the marine sediments and salt deposits left by the tsunami. But there's a third layer that makes Lisbon's archaeological record unique among flood disasters: the ash and charcoal of the fires that followed. The earthquake struck on All Saints' Day. Churches across the city were filled with lit candles for religious observances. When the buildings collapsed, those candles ignited a firestorm that burned for hours. The archaeological layers show how the disaster compounded itself, each catastrophe making the next one worse. Buildings weakened by earthquake became fuel for fires. Areas cleared by tsunami became channels for spreading flames. What makes Lisbon's destruction so archaeologically significant is how completely it erased not just buildings, but knowledge. 85% of the city's structures were destroyed, including libraries that held unique manuscripts from Portuguese explorations. The archaeological record shows fragments of books, scattered pages, the remains of collections that represented centuries of accumulated wisdom, all mixed together in layers of earthquake rubble, tsunami debris, and fire ash. But Lisbon's disaster didn't end at the city's borders. The tsunami that destroyed the harbour travelled across the Atlantic Ocean at the speed of a jet aircraft. Archaeological evidence of its passage has been found on coastlines from Ireland to the Caribbean. In Morocco, the waves reached 30 metres high. In England, Cornwall reported significant flooding. The archaeological deposits in Barbados, Martinique, and other Caribbean islands show evidence of a tsunami that crossed an entire ocean to leave its mark on shores thousands of miles from its origin. The speed and reach of the Lisbon tsunami demonstrates something profound about how interconnected the ancient world really was, and how a disaster in one place could reshape civilizations across continents. The archaeological evidence shows that coastal settlements throughout the Atlantic were affected, some abandoned permanently after the waves receded. But perhaps the most sobering aspect of Lisbon's archaeological record is how it demonstrates the fragility of knowledge itself. This wasn't just a city that was destroyed. This was a repository of human learning accumulated over centuries, reduced to scattered fragments in archaeological layers that we're still trying to piece together. Moving eastward from the Atlantic, we encounter flood disasters that reveal a different aspect of how water can erase civilizations. In the Netherlands, a region that has battled the sea for over 1,000 years, the archaeological record tells the story of communities that were literally swallowed by the ocean, not in sudden disasters, but through the slow, relentless process of land subsidence and rising seas. The medieval city of Seftinghe was once one of the wealthiest ports in northern Europe. Its merchants traded with England, France, and the German states. Its churches and guild halls represented centuries of prosperity built on the careful management of water through dikes, polders, and drainage systems. But the archaeological evidence shows that this sophisticated relationship with water contained the seeds of its own destruction. As the community grew wealthier, they built more elaborate systems to reclaim land from the sea. Each new polder, each extended dike, changed the flow patterns of tides and storms. The archaeological layers show how the city expanded onto land that was increasingly difficult to defend against the water. And then, in a series of storms during the 16th century, the sea reclaimed not just the new polders, but the entire city. What makes Seftinghe's destruction so archaeologically fascinating is how gradually it occurred compared to the sudden disasters we've explored. The archaeological record shows a community that fought the rising waters for decades. Buildings were repeatedly raised on higher foundations. Streets were elevated. Entire districts were abandoned to save others. But eventually, the sea won completely. Today, Seftinghe exists only in the archaeological record beneath the Westerschelde estuary. Marine archaeologists have found the remains of churches, houses, and harbour installations, all preserved in the anaerobic conditions of tidal flats. The city that once competed with Antwerp and Amsterdam is now a drowned landscape, visited only by researchers and the occasional fishing boat that snags its nets on medieval masonry. The gradual drowning of places like Seftinghe represents a different type of archaeological disaster, one that's becoming increasingly relevant as modern sea levels rise. These weren't communities overwhelmed by sudden catastrophe, but civilizations that simply couldn't adapt fast enough to changing conditions. In the North Sea, marine archaeologists have discovered an entire drowned landscape known as Doggerland. 8,000 years ago, this was dry land connecting Britain to continental Europe. Archaeological surveys have revealed the remains of forests, river valleys, and human settlements across an area larger than modern England. The flooding of Doggerland wasn't sudden like the Black Sea disaster or catastrophic like the Lisbon tsunami. It was the result of gradual sea level rise as the last ice age ended, combined with sudden catastrophic events like the Storegga slide, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway that generated tsunamis across the North Sea. The archaeological evidence from Doggerland tells the story of Mesolithic communities that were gradually pushed eastward as their hunting grounds and settlements disappeared beneath the waves. Fishing nets regularly bring up stone tools, animal bones, and fragments of wooden structures from what was once a rich landscape of rivers, lakes, and forests. Watologically significant is how it demonstrates that makes Doggerland Archae land loss and civilization displacement have been recurring themes throughout human history. The communities that lived in Doggerland weren't primitive hunter-gatherers, but sophisticated people with complex technologies for managing coastal and riverine environments. As their homeland disappeared beneath the North Sea, they carried their knowledge and skills to new territories, influencing the development of cultures across northern Europe. But some of the most dramatic archaeological evidence of flood-related civilization collapse comes from regions where natural disasters combined with human engineering to create catastrophes that neither could have caused alone. In the Netherlands during the 13th century, the St. Elizabeth's flood of 1421 demonstrates how human modifications to natural systems can amplify disaster beyond anything previously experienced. The Zuiderzee region had been gradually reclaimed from the sea through an intricate system of dikes, polders, and drainage canals. Communities had flourished in this engineered landscape for centuries, developing sophisticated techniques for managing water that were admired throughout Europe. But the archaeological record shows that this very sophistication created vulnerabilities that natural systems wouldn't have had. When the storm surge of 1421 breached the primary sea defences, the water didn't just flood the land, it followed the human-engineered channels directly into the heart of the settled areas. The very drainage systems that had made the region habitable became highways for destruction. Archaeological excavations have revealed how quickly entire districts were overwhelmed, with flood deposits containing everything from household goods to livestock, all jumbled together in the chaos of communities that had only hours to evacuate. The archaeological layers from the St. Elizabeth's flood show something unique among the disasters we've explored. This wasn't just natural force overwhelming human engineering. This was human engineering amplifying natural force to create destruction that neither could have achieved alone. The flood channels that were designed to move water safely away from settlements instead concentrated the storm surge into devastating torrents that carved through the landscape like liquid dynamite. What makes this disaster archaeologically significant is how it demonstrates the unintended consequences of environmental modification. The communities that were destroyed by the St. Elizabeth's flood weren't primitive settlements vulnerable to natural forces. They were some of the most technologically advanced water management societies in medieval Europe, yet their very sophistication created new types of vulnerability that they couldn't anticipate. As we trace these patterns of flood destruction across different cultures and time periods, the archaeological evidence reveals something profound about the relationship between human civilization and natural forces. The most advanced societies, the ones with the most sophisticated technologies, and the deepest understanding of their environments, often created the conditions for their own most complete destruction. This pattern appears repeatedly in the archaeological record. Societies develop technologies that allow them to thrive in challenging environments. They build cities in river valleys because of the fertile soil. They construct elaborate harbour facilities to take advantage of maritime trade. They create irrigation systems to support larger populations than the natural environment could sustain. But these very adaptations often place them directly in the path of the catastrophic events that their technologies cannot contain. The archaeological evidence suggests that there may be an inherent tension between the scale of human ambition and the scale of natural forces. Communities that remain small and dispersed can often survive disasters that completely erase larger, more concentrated settlements. Technologies that work perfectly under normal conditions can become death traps when conditions exceed their design parameters. In the American Southwest, archaeological sites like those at Chaco Canyon tell the story of sophisticated civilizations that thrived for centuries through careful management of scarce water resources, only to be abandoned when climatic changes made their elaborate systems inadequate. The great houses and ceremonial structures of Chaco represent some of the most advanced architecture in pre-Columbian North America. Yet the archaeological record shows they were abandoned not through conquest or decline, but because the hydrological systems they depended on could no longer sustain them. The lesson from these archaeological disasters isn't that technology and engineering are futile against natural forces. The lesson is that the relationship between human systems and natural systems is more complex and more fragile than we often assume. The archaeological record shows that the most successful ancient civilizations were those that maintained flexibility, that didn't commit everything to single solutions, that preserved multiple ways of adapting when their primary strategies failed. But even flexible societies could be overwhelmed when natural forces exceeded anything in their historical experience. The archaeological evidence from sites these archaeological landscapes of disaster, we begin donment or destruction. As we move through becomes impossible, points where the only choice is Aben across the world, shows that there are thresholds beyond which adaptation to understand why flood stories appear in the mythologies of cultures across the globe. These aren't just symbolic narratives about divine judgment or moral lessons. They are cultural memories of real events, preserved in the collective consciousness of peoples whose ancestors witnessed the complete erasure of their worlds. The archaeological record gives substance to these memories. In the sediment layers and artifact distributions, in the patterns of abandonment and reconstruction, we can read the actual history behind the myths. The great floods remembered in human story weren't single events, but recurring catastrophes that shaped the development of civilization itself. What makes these archaeological flood stories so compelling isn't just their drama or their scale. It's how they illuminate the fundamental relationship between human ambition and natural force, between the permanence we try to build into our world and the impermanence that defines our actual condition. The cities buried beneath flood sediments remind us that our own urban environments, our own technologies, our own assumptions about permanence and progress exist in the same relationship to natural forces that has always defined human civilization. The archaeological record doesn't just tell us about the past. It provides a mirror for understanding the present and perhaps preparing for futures that may challenge our own assumptions about what can and cannot be washed away. In the quiet hours of archaeological excavation, when researchers carefully brush sediment away from artifacts that haven't seen daylight for thousands of years, there's always the recognition that they're uncovering not just objects, but stories. Stories of people who built homes and raised families and created beautiful things, never knowing that they were living in the final chapters of their civilization's existence. The pottery shards and building foundations, the scattered tools and fragmentary inscriptions, all speak to the essential humanity of these lost worlds. These weren't abstract civilizations that rose and fell according to some inevitable historical logic. These were communities of individuals who woke up each morning and went about their lives, who had plans and dreams and expectations about the future, right up until the moment when the future they had imagined was literally washed away. And in that recognition, the archaeological record of ancient floods becomes something more than just scientific data or historical curiosity. It becomes a meditation on the fragility and resilience of human life itself, played out across the vast scales of geological time and preserved in the patient accumulation of sediment and artifact that we call the archaeological record. The archaeological evidence from these drowned civilizations forces us to confront an UN's itself. When water erases a city, it doesn't just etling truth about the nature of memory verse. The chain of transmission that carries knowledge destroy buildings and kill people. It see from one generation to the next. The flood survivors who manage to escape carry fragments, scattered pieces of what once was, but the complete picture dissolves in the chaos of displacement and trauma. Consider what happens to language when its speakers are scattered by catastrophe. The Indus Valley script remains undeciphered, not because ancient people lacked sophistication, but because the floods that destroyed their cities also destroyed the continuity of their writing system. When archaeologists find inscribed seals and tablets in the ruins of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, they're looking at a language that died with its last fluent speakers, preserved only in clay fragments that tell stories we can no longer read. This pattern repeats across the archaeological record. Linear A, the script of the Minoans, became incomprehensible after the tsunamis that followed the Thera eruption disrupted their civilization. The languages spoken in the Black Sea communities before the Great Flood left no descendants, no dictionaries, no Rosetta Stones to help us understand what those drowned peoples called themselves or how they understood their world. The erasure is so complete that we often discover these lost civilizations by accident. Marine archaeologists searching for shipwrecks instead find the remains of harbours that were functioning ports when the water level was 300 feet lower. Geologists studying river systems uncover the foundations of cities that existed before the rivers changed course. Construction workers digging foundations for modern buildings break through into underground spaces that turn out to be the buried streets of settlements that vanished so completely their names don't appear in any historical record. In the Mediterranean, underwater surveys have revealed submerged settlements off the coasts of Greece, Turkey, and the Levant. These aren't the remains of fishing villages or seasonal camps. These are sophisticated urban centres with stone-built houses, public buildings, and harbour installations. The pottery found in these drowned ruins shows trade connections that span the ancient world. Yet these cities appear in no ancient text, no historical chronicle, no mythological tradition. They existed, they thrived. They were erased so completely that even their names were forgotten. What makes these discoveries so archaeologically significant is how they demonstrate the incompleteness of our historical record. We tend to think of ancient history as a progression from simple to complex, from scattered tribes to organized states to classical civilizations. But the underwater archaeological evidence suggests a different pattern. Sophisticated urban societies rising and falling, sometimes repeatedly, with each flood cycle erasing not just the physical remains, but the memory of what came before. The technological implications are equally profound. When archaeologists examine the engineering remains from these submerged sites, they often find evidence of capabilities that seem advanced even by later standards. Precision-cut stone blocks fitted together without mortar. Drainage systems that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of hydraulics. Harbour constructions that show mastery of marine engineering principles. At the underwater site of Pavlopetri off the coast of Greece, marine archaeologists have mapped what may be the world's oldest submerged city. The settlement dates to around 2800 BC, making it contemporary with the early pyramids of Egypt. Yet the urban planning shows a level of sophistication that wouldn't be seen again in the region for over 1,000 years. Streets lay separate areas for residential, commercial, and religious functions. Add out in organized grids, harbour complex that could accommodate large trading vessels. The site was preserved by rising sea levels around 1000 BC, when seismic activity caused the entire coastline to subside. The archaeological evidence shows no gradual abandonment, no slow decline. The pottery found in houses still sits on tables where it was left. Storage jars still contain the remains of grain and olive oil. The preservation is so complete that archaeologists can trace the daily routines of people who lived through the moment when their 1,000 years ago, right up to worlds sank beneath the waves. But what haunts researchers studying Pavlopetri isn't just the quality of preservation. It's the realization that this sophisticated urban centre existed at the same time as other well-documented ancient civilizations, yet it appears in no historical record. No Egyptian text mentions trade with this port. No Mesopotamian chronicle records its merchants. No mythological tradition preserves its memory. If marine archaeologists hadn't stumbled across its remains, we would never have known it existed. This pattern of archaeological invisibility appears at flood sites across the globe. In the Gulf of Kambat, off India's west coast, Marine surveys have identified what appear to be the remains of large settlements dating to around 9,000 years ago. Sonar imaging reveals geometric patterns consistent with urban planning. Dredging operations have brought up pottery, beads, and stone tools. Yet these potential cities exist at the very edge of what we consider possible for human civilization at that time period. The dating is controversial precisely because it challenges our assumptions about when complex urban societies could have existed. If the Gulf of Cambat sites are genuine cities rather than natural formations, they would represent urban civilization developing thousands of years earlier than the traditional archaeological timeline suggests. But the flu record of their existence, leaving that preserved them, also erased any written only the ambiguous testimony of stones and artifacts scattered across the seafloor. Similar mysteries emerge from underwater archaeological sites around Japan. The Yonaguni Monument, a massive stone structure lying beneath 75 feet of water off the coast of Okinawa, has sparked decades of debate about its origins. The structure appears to show evidence of deliberate construction, with straight edges, right angles, and what look like stairs and platforms carved into solid rock. Yet it lies beneath water levels that rose at the end of the last ice age, suggesting that if it is artificial, it was built by people with sophisticated stoneworking capabilities over 10,000 years ago. Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical, arguing that the Yonaguni structure could be the result of natural geological processes. But the debate itself illuminates something important about how flood disasters affect the archaeological record. When rising seas submerge evidence of human activity, that evidence becomes much harder to study and much easier to dismiss. The underwater environment preserves some things remarkably well while destroying others completely, creating archaeological puzzles that resist easy interpretation. The challenge isn't just technical, though sophisticated underwater archaeology requires expensive equipment and specialized expertise. The deeper challenge is conceptual. Each new discovery of sophisticated underwater remains forces archaeologists to reconsider assumptions about the timeline of human development and the completeness of the historical record. In the Caribbean, marine archaeologists have found evidence of pre-Columbian settlements submerged by rising sea levels. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar surveys have identified what appear to be megalithic structures lying in over 2,000 feet of water. The depth suggests that if these are artificial constructions, they were built when sea levels were dramatically lower, possibly during the last ice age. But the technological implications of stone construction at such an early period, in a region that wasn't supposed to support complex civilizations until much later, challenge fundamental assumptions about the development of New World cultures. The Cuban discoveries remain highly controversial, with many archaeologists arguing that the sonar images show natural rock formations rather than artificial structures. But the controversy itself demonstrates how underwater flood archaeology operates at the intersection of technological possibility and theoretical framework. Each new discovery has to be evaluated not just for what it reveals about the past, but for how it fits with existing models of human development. What emerges from these underwater archaeological investigations is a picture of human civilization that's far more complex and far more fragmented than traditional historical accounts suggest. Instead of a steady progression from simple to complex, the evidence points towards cycles of development and destruction, with each major flood event erasing not just physical structures, but entire chapters of human experience. The psychological impact of such complete erasure may explain why flood stories occupy such a central place in human mythology. These aren't just narratives about natural disasters, they're stories about the fundamental vulnerability of everything humans create. The flood myth appears in cultures across the globe because flood disasters have repeatedly demonstrated that no human achievement, no matter how grand or seemingly permanent, is guaranteed to survive the forces of nature. But the archaeological evidence also reveals something remarkable about human resilience. Even after the most catastrophic floods, survivors found ways to preserve and transmit essential knowledge. The flood stories themselves represent one form of preservation, encoding crucial information about past disasters in narrative forms that could survive the destruction of written records. Archaeological evidence suggests that flood survivors often carried specific technologies and practices to new locations, seeding the development of new civilizations with fragments of older knowledge. The sudden appearance of sophisticated agricultural techniques, architectural styles, or craft traditions in the archaeological record may represent not independent invention, but the arrival of refugees carrying skills learned in drowned homelands. In the Andean highlands, archaeological sites show evidence of advanced hydraulic engineering that appears suddenly in the record without apparent local precedents. Terracing systems, irrigation channels, and water management techniques that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of mountain hydrology. Some researchers have suggested that these technologies were developed by people fleeing flood disasters in lower elevations, carrying their knowledge of water management to new environments where it had to be adapted to different conditions. The pattern appears in other regions as well. In Mesopotamia, the earliest urban centers show evidence of advanced drainage and flood control systems that seem to represent accumulated knowledge rather than gradual development. The sophistication suggests that the builders had prior experience with flood management, possibly gained through disasters that destroyed earlier settlements. This transmission of flood-related knowledge through displaced populations may explain some of the most puzzling aspects of early urban development. Why did cities in different regions develop similar solutions to water management problems? Why do archaeological sites separated by thousands of miles show evidence of comparable engineering capabilities? The answer may lie in the mobility of flood survivors, carrying practical knowledge across vast distances as they search for new places to rebuild. But the archaeological record also shows that transmitted knowledge often became fragmentary and distorted in the process of transmission. Techniques that worked perfectly in one environment might be only partially successful in another. Engineering solutions designed for specific geographical conditions might be misapplied in different settings, leading to new types of vulnerability. At Çatalhöyük in Turkey, one of the world's earliest urban settlements, archaeologists have found evidence of sophisticated understanding of earthquake engineering, with buildings constructed to flex rather than break during seismic events. But the same site shows repeated episodes of flooding that the builders seemed less prepared to handle. The archaeological layer's selective preservation of knowledge appears repeatedly in the flue, suggest a community that had mastered one type of natural disaster while remaining vulnerable to others. This archaeological record. Communities that survived one type of disaster often carried forward the specific adaptations that enabled their survival, while losing other types of knowledge that weren't immediately relevant to their new circumstances. Over time, this process created a patchwork of preserved and lost capabilities that makes the archaeological record difficult to interpret. The loss isn't just technological. Archaeological evidence suggests that flood disasters also disrupted the social and religious systems that gave meaning to technological practices. Ritual knowledge, ceremonial traditions, and the symbolic frameworks that integrated practical skills into cultural wholes were often harder to preserve than the practical skills themselves. At Poverty Point in Louisiana, archaeologists have found evidence of a sophisticated Native American culture that flourished between 1700 and 1100 BC. The site includes massive earthwork constructions that demonstrate advanced understanding of engineering and astronomy. But the culture appears to have ended abruptly, possibly as a result of flooding from the Mississippi River system. The archaeological evidence shows sophisticated technological capabilities combined with complex ritual practices, but no clear descendants who preserved both the practical and symbolic aspects of the culture. The Poverty Point example illustrates something important about how flood disasters affect cultural transmission. While practical knowledge might survive in simplified forms, the complex cultural systems that gave that knowledge meaning and context were often lost completely. Survivors might remember how to build flood defenses, but forget why certain designs were considered sacred, or what ceremonial practices were associated with their construction. This fragmentation of cultural knowledge may explain some of the most mysterious aspects of ancient flood sites. Why do we find evidence of sophisticated engineering capabilities combined with what appears to be cultural discontinuity? Why do some archaeological sites show advanced technical knowledge apparently divorced from the cultural contexts that would normally surround such achievements? The answer may lie in the nature of flood survival itself. Catastrophic floods select for certain types of knowledge while eliminating others. Practical skills that enable immediate survival are more likely to be preserved than abstract knowledge or ceremonial practices. Technical capabilities that can be quickly applied in new environments travel better than cultural traditions that depend on specific places or social structures. Over time, this selective pressure creates archaeological records that seem puzzling or incomplete. We find the technical achievements of lost civilizations without the cultural contexts that made those achievements meaningful to their creators. We discover evidence of sophisticated capabilities whose purposes we can no longer understand, because the symbolic frameworks that explained their significance were lost in the flood. But perhaps the most profound impact of flood disasters on human civilization has been their effect on our relationship with time itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that pre-flood societies often operated with different temporal perspectives than post-flood cultures. Communities that had experienced catastrophic floods developed acute awareness of the fragility of human achievement and the possibility that everything could be lost. This awareness appears in the archaeological record as a particular type of monumentality, construction projects that seem designed not just to serve immediate functions, but to survive catastrophic destruction. The massive stone constructions at sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey or the megalithic temples of Malta represent investments of labor and resources that far exceed what would be necessary were built by communities that understood for purely functional purposes. Archaeological evidence suggests that these monuments the possibility of civilizational collapse and wanted to create something that might survive such disasters. The temporal perspective of flood survivors also appears in the archaeological record through patterns of knowledge preservation. Sites that show evidence of flood damage often contain what appear to be archives or repositories, concentrations of valuable objects or information that seem to have been deliberately cached against future disasters. These archaeological deposits suggest communities that had learned to prepare for the possibility that their normal systems of knowledge transmission Kanesh in Turkey, archaeologists have found evidence of might be disrupted. At Assyrian merchant archives that were apparently buried in Antisipe, creators understood the possibility that normal record-keeping systemization of political or natural disasters. The tablets contain detailed records of trade networks, legal agreements, and commercial practices, preserved in ways that suggest their flood sites across the ancient world. Evidence about how flood experiences shaped ancient evidence of disaster preparation reveals something important: loss of cultural memory. This archaeological might be destroyed. Similar patterns appear at consciousness. Communities that survived major flood disasters often developed what of communities that had learned to hedge against the complete we might call catastrophic thinking could change suddenly and completely. This awareness influence, an awareness that normal conditions, not just practical preparations like flood defenses or elevated construction, but fundamental approaches to knowledge preservation and cultural with flood vulnerability appears in the archaeological record through transmission, the psychological impact of living styles, and material culture. Communities that experience changes in settlement patterns, architectural catastrophic flooding often rebuilt in ways that prioritized mobility over permanence, creating architectural if necessary. In the archaeological and technological systems that could be quickly dismantled and relocate layers following major flood events, researchers often find evidence of cultural practices that seem designed to maintain group cohesion in the face of potential displacement. Portable art objects, standardized tool technologies, and ritual practices that didn't require permanent installations, all suggest communities that had learned to define their identity in ways that could survive the loss of specific places. But the archaeological record also shows that this catastrophic awareness came with costs. Communities that organized themselves around the possibility of flood disasters often seemed less capable of the kind of long-term investment and specialization that enables complex cultural development. The energy that went into disaster preparation was energy that couldn't be devoted to other forms of cultural achievement. This tension between preparedness and development appears throughout the flood archaeological record. Sites that show the most sophisticated flood defenses often show less evidence of artistic achievement, intellectual development, or technological innovation. Communities that invested heavily in survival capabilities sometimes seem to sacrifice other aspects of human flourishing. The archaeological evidence suggests that ancient peoples understood this trade-off and made conscious choices about how to balance security against other values. Some communities chose to invest in permanent achievements despite flood risks, creating magnificent but vulnerable civilizations. Others prioritized survival capabilities, creating more resilient but less spectacular cultures. Neither strategy guaranteed long-term success. The archaeological record contains examples of both approaches being overwhelmed by flood disasters that exceeded their preparations. But the evidence also shows that communities with different strategies left different types of archaeological signatures, contributing to our understanding of the range of human responses to environmental uncertainty. As we trace these patterns through the archaeological record of flood disasters, what, and far more fragile than traditional historical emerges, is a picture of human civilization that's far more dynamic narratives suggest. The comfortable assumption that cultural development follows a steady upward trajectory, with each generation building on the achievements of the previous one, dissolves when confronted with the archaeological evidence of what floods can erase. Instead, the record suggests cycles of achievement and destruction, with each major flood event creating discontinuities that forced survivors to rebuild not just their physical world, but their entire approach to living in environments where catastrophe was always possible. The civiled not just by their immediatizations that emerged from these cycles were shaped circumstances, but by the traumatic memory of what water could wash away. This cyclical pattern may explain some of the most puzzling aspects of ancient history. Why do we find evidence of sophisticated capabilities that seem to appear and disappear without obvious precedents or descendants? Why do some ancient achievements seem so far in advance of their apparent cultural context? The answer may lie in the hidden history of flood disasters that created conditions where advanced knowledge could be preserved in fragmentary forms while the cultural systems that created that knowledge were lost. The archaeological record of flood disasters ultimately tells us something profound about the nature of human achievement itself. Our greatest creations, our most sophisticated technologies, our most beautiful art, all exist in relationship to forces that can erase them without warning. The flood sites scattered across the archaeological landscape remind us that permanence is always provisional, that every human achievement exists in negotiation with the possibility of its own destruction. But the same archaeological record also testifies to something remarkable about human resilience and creativity. Even after the most catastrophic floods, survivors found ways to preserve essential knowledge, to maintain cultural continuity, to rebuild in ways that honored what was lost while adapting to new realities. The very existence of flood stories in human mythology represents a triumph of cultural transmission, the successful preservation of crucial knowledge across the gap of catastrophic destruction. In the patient work of archaeological excavation, in the careful analysis of flood deposits and artifact distributions, in the slow process of piecing together the stories of lost civilizations, we participate in this ongoing process of recovery and preservation. Each new discovery adds another fragment to our understanding of what floods have erased and what human ingenuity has managed the forces that shape human civilization. In Add to Preserve, the archaeological record of ancient flood disasters doesn't just tell us about the past. It provides a lens for understanding our own relationship to create new types of systematic vulnerability. The lessons rates populations in flood-vulnerable areas, where technological complexity lines and river systems, where urban growth constant world, where climate change threatens to reshape coast preserved in flood sediments and scattered artifacts, become more than under which human civilization has always historical curiosities. They become reminders of the fundamental conditions existed and guidance for how we might prepare for the floods that are yet to come. The story of flood destruction doesn't end with ancient civilizations. In the modern era, we find perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of how water can erase an entire city in a matter of hours. September 8th, 1900. Galveston, Texas stood as the fourth largest city in the United States, a thriving metropolis built on a barrier island in the Gulf of Mexico. Its port rivaled New York in commercial importance. Its architecture showcased the wealth of cotton merchants and shipping magnates. Its residents lived with the confidence that comes from technological superiority and economic prosperity. The city had weathered storms before. Its leaders believed their elevated buildings and modern infrastructure could withstand whatever the Gulf might deliver. Weather forecasting was primitive, but the signs that morning seemed manageable. A tropical storm approaching from the southeast. Nothing the prosperous city hadn't handled in the past. By noon, the barometric pressure had dropped to levels that would later be recognized as catastrophe wall of water toward the Texas struck. Galveston was 120 miles per hour were driving AIC. By evening, winds exceeding one coast. The storm surged that it just flooding. It was a moving mountain of ocean, 15 feet high. Traveling record of Galveston's destruction tells a story at the speed of an express train. The archaeological that unfolds in layers of debris and desperation. First came the wind damage, the archaeological signature of roofs torn away and windows shattered. Then came the culture of a modern city. Houses surge itself, carrying with it not just water but the entire material, carriages, telegraph poles, railroad cars, all transformed into battering rams that smashed against whatever structures remained standing. What makes Galveston archaeologically unique among flood disasters is the completeness of the documentation. Unlike ancient floods that must be reconstructed from scattered artifacts and geological deposits, the Galveston disaster was recorded by photographers, journalists, and survivors whose accounts provide detailed context for the physical evidence. The photographs taken in the aftermath show an archaeological landscape of destruction that rivals any ancient disaster site. Entire city blocks reduced to scattered timber and twisted metal. Neighborhoods where every building was demolished down to its foundation. Streets over mounds of wreckage to search for survivors. Filled with debris so deep that rescue workers had to climb. But it's the human archaeology of Galveston that makes the disaster so haunting. The storm killed between 6,000 and 12,000 people, most of them by drowning as the surge swept across the island. The bodies were initially buried in mass graves, but when later storms threatened to uncover them, the city made the decision to burn the remains on funeral pyres that lasted for weeks. The demographic archaeology of the disaster reveals something profound about how floods select their victims. The wealthy districts on higher ground suffered property damage, but relatively few casualties. The working-class neighborhoods near the waterfront were almost completely destroyed. Entire families disappear later, miles from where their homes without trace. Children were found days had stood, their bodies the only evidence that those homes had ever existed. Galveston's reconstruction created its own archaeological record. The city decided to raise its elevation by pumping sand urban area. Houses were dredged from the harbour onto the entire act up on stilts, while sand was pumped beneath them. The process buried the pre-storm city under several feet of fill, creating an archaeological sequence that preserves the moment of destruction beneath the layer of reconstruction. Modern archaeological investigations in Galveston have uncovered this buried city, revealing foundations, sidewalks, and personal possessions exactly as they were left after the storm. The preservation is remarkable. Jewelry boxes with their contents intact, children's toys still arranged on bedroom floors, kitchen utensils still in their drawers. The archaeology of interrupted lives preserved beneath the sand of rebuilding. What the Galveston archaeological record demonstrates is how quickly modern urban civilization can become archaeological deposit. The sophisticated infrastructure that supported 40,000 people, the commercial networks that connected Texas to global markets, the cultural institutions that made Galveston a center of learning and art, all reduced to layers of storm debris and sand fill in a matter of hours. The speed of the transformation challenges our assumptions about the relationship between technological advancement and disaster vulnerability. Galveston in 1900 possessed communications technology, modern construction techniques, and scientific understanding that far exceeded any ancient civilization. Yet when the surge struck, all of these advantages proved irrelevant. The city was erased as completely as any Bronze Age settlement. Moving northward along the American coast, we encounter a different type of flood disaster that reveals how human modification of natural systems can create vulnerabilities that wouldn't exist in unaltered environments. The Great New England Hurricane of 90 region that had been extensively modified by 3 in 38 struck a centuries of European settlement. Rivers had been dammed to power mills, wetlands had been drained for agriculture, coastal areas villages. The landscape that face had been developed with summer homes and fishing. The hurricane wasn't natural, but a hybrid system where human engineering had altered the flow patterns that would determine how storm water moved across the region. When the hurricane struck, it brought with it not just wind and rain, but a storm surge that interacted with the modified landscape in ways that no one had anticipated. Rivers that had been channelized to prevent ordinary flooding became torrents that carved new channels through downtown districts. Seasonal high water became obstacles dams that were designed to control that backed up floodwaters into populated areas. The archaeological record of the New England hurricane reveals a pattern that appears repeatedly in modern flood disasters. Human modifications designed to prevent flooding often create new types of flood vulnerability. Engineering solutions that work perfectly under normal conditions can amplify disaster when conditions exceed their design parameters. In downtown Hartford, Connecticut, the archaeological layers show how the hurricane surge interacted with urban infrastructure to create destruction that exceeded what either natural flooding or hurricane winds could have caused alone. Storm drains became pressurized conduits that shot water into building basements. Subway tunnels became underground rivers that undermined the foundations of major buildings. The preservation of the disaster record is enhanced by the photographic documentation and insurance records that capture not just the physical damage, but the economic and social disruption that followed. Entire industries were wiped out overnight. Transportation networks that had developed over decades were severed by bridge failures and rail line washouts. Communities that had existed for generations simply ceased to function. What makes the New England hurricane archaeologically significant is how it demonstrates the cascading effects of flood disasters in complex modern societies. The initial physical damage from wind and water was amplified by secondary effects as interconnected systems failed. Power outages darkened entire states. Communication failures isolated communities. Supply chain disruptions created shortages of food and medical supplies. The archaeological record shows industrial survival strategies even as they remain communities that were forced to revert to pred, surrounded by the debris of industrial civilization. People cooked overally equipped kitchens, They wood fires in the ruins of electric drew water from wells that hadn't on horse-drawn transportation through it been used since municipal systems were installed. They rely streets littered with automobiles. This reversion pattern appears in the archaeological record of flood disasters throughout history. When the systems that support complex civilization are disrupted, survivors often fall back on older, simpler technologies that are more resilient to environmental disruption. The archaeological layers show this transition clearly, with evidence of sophisticated technologies abandoned in favor of more basic tools and techniques. But the New England hurricane also reveals something remarkable about modern disaster recovery capabilities. Unlike ancient flood disasters that often resulted in permanent abandonment, the New England communities were rebuilt within months. Federal assistance, insurance payments, and industrial capacity enabled reconstruction on a scale and at a speed that would have been impossible in earlier eras. The post-disaster archaeology shows not just reconstruction, but improvement. Buildings were rebuilt to higher standards. Flood control systems were upgraded. Land use patterns were modified to reduce future vulnerability. The disaster became a catalyst for changes that made the region more resilient to future floods. This pattern of improvement through disaster appears repeatedly in the modern archaeological record. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 led to building codes that became models for urban fire safety worldwide. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 resulted in construction techniques that improved seismic resilience throughout California. The London floods of 1928 prompted innovations in urban drainage that were copied across Europe. The archaeological record suggests that modern industrial societies have developed capabilities for learning from disaster that didn't exist in earlier eras. The combination of scientific analysis, engineering expertise, and institutional memory enables modern communities to extract lessons from catastrophic events and incorporate those lessons into improved systems. But this learning capacity comes with its own vulnerabilities. The archaeological evidence flood defenses can encourage development in areas that remain disaster recovery can create new types of risk. Improve from sites like New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina shows how fundamentally vulnerable. Better early warning systems can create false confidence in technological solutions to environmental problems. The Katrina archaeological record is particularly revealing because it shows how modern flood disasters intersect with social and economic inequalities in ways that amplify their human impact. The neighborhoods that were most severely flooded were also the neighborhoods with the least capacity for recovery. The archaeological pattern shows, and demographic characteristics, lower clear correlations between elevation, flood damage lying areas, which experienced the most severe flooding, were disproportionately inhabited by low-income communities and communities of color. These areas also showed the slowest recovery rates and the highest rates of permanent abandonment. The archaeological record documents not just physical destruction, but social destruction that transformed the demographic composition of the entire city. What makes the New Orleans case archaeologically unique is how it demonstrates the intersection of natural disaster with human systems of inequality. The floodwaters didn't discriminate, but the systems that determined who lived where, who had resources for evacuation, and who had access to recovery assistance created patterns of impact that were anything but natural. The archaeological record shows communities that simply vanished after the flood. Not because the physical damage was irreparable, but because the social and economic systems that supported those communities were disrupted beyond recovery. Schools closed permanently. Businesses relocated to other cities. Families scattered to distant states. The archaeology of social dissolution preserved in abandoned lots and demolished foundations. This pattern of selective recovery appears in the archaeological record of flood disasters throughout history, but it becomes more visible and more systematically documented in the modern era. Ancient flood sites often show evidence of complete abandonment, followed by eventual resettlement by different populations. Modern flood sites show change. and long-term social reorgan, more complex patterns of partial recovery, demographicization. The technological capabilities that enable rapid physical reconstruction don't necessarily extend to social and cultural reconstruction. Buildings can be rebuilt in months, but communities may take generations to recover their social cohesion and cultural continuity. The archaeological record captures this distinction in the different preservation patterns of material and social evidence. Moving beyond American examples, we find that flood disasters in other regions reveal different aspects of how modern societies interact with environmental catastrophe. The archaeological record of the 1976 Tangshan earthquake and flood in China documents one of the most thorough disaster responses in modern history. The earthquake struck during the night, killing over 200,000 people and destroying most of the city's infrastructure. But the disaster was compounded by dam failures that sent floodwaters through the ruined city, creating archaeological deposits that combine seismic and hydraulic destruction in ways that are unique in the modern record. The Chinese response to the Tangshan disaster created an archaeological record of systematic reconstruction that reflects the centralized planning capabilities of the state socialist system. Rather than gradual rebuilding, the government implemented a complete urban redesign that created new neighborhoods, new infrastructure, and new social institutions. The archaeological record shows the old city buried beneath the new construction, but preserved in ways that enable detailed study of how the disaster unfolded. The combination of earthquake damage and flood deposits creates a chronological sequence that can be read like pages in a book, showing exactly how different parts of the city were affected and in what order. What makes Tangshan archaeologically significant is how it demonstrates the capacity of modern states to treat disaster as an opportunity for comprehensive social reorganization. The rebuilt city wasn't just an urban life that incorporated lessons learned from the disaster, the new restoration of what existed before, but a reimagining of Tangshan was designed with seismic resistance as a primary consideration. Buildings were constructed to earthquake codes that exceeded international standards. Infrastructure was designed with redundancy that could maintain function even after major damage. Social institutions were reorganized to support disaster preparedness and community resilience. The archaeological record documents this transformation in layers that show not just physical reconstruction, but social reconstruction. The material culture of the new city reflects different values and different assumptions about the relationship between human communities and environmental risk. But the Tangshan example also illustrates the limitations of top-down disaster response. While the physical reconstruction was remarkably successful, the social and cultural disruption created by the complete reorganization of the city had effects that appear in the archaeological record for decades afterward. Traditional neighborhood structures were replaced by planned residential blocks. Extended family networks were disrupted by new housing assignments. Local businesses and informal economic systems were replaced by state-managed enterprises. The archaeology shows material improvement combined with social discontinuity in ways that parallel some ancient flood recovery patterns. This tension between physical and social reconstruction appears throughout the modern archaeological record of flood disasters. The technological capabilities that enable rapid rebuilding don't automatically restore the social networks and cultural practices that make communities resilient to future disasters. In Japan, the archaeological record of the 2011 tsunami provides perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of how modern societies experience and recover from catastrophic flooding. The disaster struck a region with sophisticated early warning systems, advanced construction techniques, and detailed disaster preparedness plans. Yet the archaeological record shows that even the most prepared modern communities can be overwhelmed when natural forces exceed the parameters of their planning. The tsunami waves reached heights that exceeded the design specifications of seawalls that had been built to the highest international standards. The the flooding penetrated inland farther than any historical precedent suggested was possible. The archaeological preservation is unprecedented in its completeness. Satellite imagery captured the progression of the flood in real time. Security cameras recorded the moment when tsunami waves overwhelmed coastal defenses. GPS tracking systems documented the movement of debris across hundreds of square kilometers. The result is an archaeological record that captures not just the end result of the disaster, but its entire temporal development. Researchers can trace how the floodwaters moved through urban areas, how they interacted with different types of infrastructure, how they transported and deposited different categories of debris. The cultural preservation is equally remarkable. The tsunami carried away entire museums, libraries, and archives, but it also preserved their contents in ways that enable detailed study. Waterlogged documents, scattered artworks, and displaced artifacts create an archaeological record of cultural destruction and preservation that reveals how floods affect not just physical infrastructure, but human memory and knowledge. What emerges from the Japanese tsunami archaeological record is a new understanding of how flood disasters interact with the information systems that define modern civilization. Digital records were lost when server facilities flooded. Communication networks failed when transmission towers were destroyed. Financial systems were disrupted when bank buildings were swept away. But the same digital technologies that were vulnerable to flood damage also enabled new forms of disaster documentation and recovery. Social media platforms became tools for coordinating rescue efforts. Satellite imagery provided real-time damage assessment. Digital archives preserved cultural materials that would have been permanently lost in earlier eras. The archaeological record documents this paradox of technological vulnerability and technological resilience in ways that illuminate fundamental questions about how modern societies prepare for and recover from environmental disasters. As we trace these patterns of flood destruction and recovery across different time periods and different technological contexts, what emerges is a complex picture of the relationship between human civilization and environmental forces. The archaeological record shows that while our technological capabilities have advanced dramatically, the fundamental dynamics of flood disaster remain remarkably consistent. Water still erases. Communities still struggle to balance investment in disaster preparedness against other social priorities. Survivors still face the challenge of preserving essential knowledge and social cohesion across the gap of catastrophic destruction. The archaeological record still captures these human struggles in layers of sediment and scattered artifacts. But the modern record also reveals new possibilities for learning from disaster and building resilience that weren't available to earlier societies. The combination of scientific understanding, technological capability, and institutional memory creates opportunities for adaptive response that appear in the archaeological record as improved reconstruction and reduced vulnerability to repeat disasters. The question that haunts the archaeological record of flood disasters, both ancient and modern, is whether this learning capacity is sufficient to address the scale of environmental change that current climate science projects. The flood disasters of the past, catastrophic as they were for the communities that experienced them, occurred within relatively stable global environmental conditions. The flood disasters of the future may unfold in the context of systematically changing climate conditions that could overwhelm even the most sophisticated adaptation strategies. The archaeological record provides both warnings about the limits of human adaptation and examples of successful recovery that offer hope for navigating an uncertain environmental future. In the quiet spaces of archaeological excavation, where researchers carefully document the layers of human achievement and natural destruction, the flood disasters of the past speak to the flood challenges of the present and future. Each artifact recovered, each stratigraphic sequence mapped, each pattern of abandonment and recovery analyzed, contributes to our understanding of how human societies can survive and thrive in a world where catastrophic flooding remains an ever-present possibility. The archaeological record doesn't provide simple answers or easy solutions, but it does provide something equally valuable: a deep time perspective on the relationship between human ambition and environmental forces, preserved in the patient accumulation of evidence that we call the archaeological record. The silence that follows catastrophic flooding is unlike any other silence. It's not the peaceful quiet of evening, or the gentle hush of snow falling. It's the silence of absence, where familiar sounds should be, but aren't. No church bells marking the hours. No market vendors calling their wares. No children's laughter echoing through streets that no longer exist. This is the silence that archaeologists encounter when they excavate flood sites. A silence so complete, it seems to have weight. In the archives of the Dutch National Museum, researchers have been studying an unusual collection of documents that survived the St. Elizabeth's Day flood of 1421. These aren't official records or religious texts, but personal letters, shopping lists, and children's drawings that were preserved in sealed containers when their owners fled rising waters. The mundane details of daily life frozen at the moment of catastrophe. One letter, written by a merchant's wife to her sister, breaks off mid-sentence. The ink changes colour where water began seeping into the room. Another document, a child's arithmetic lesson, shows water stains that follow the progression of floodwaters up the page. These aren't just historical artifacts. They're archaeological evidence of how quickly normal life transitions to emergency, how the routine of human existence can be interrupted by forces that recognize no human schedule. The psychological archaeology of flood disasters reveals patterns that transcend individual cultures and time periods. In the debris layers of ancient Mesopotamian cities, archaeologists find evidence of hasty burial rituals, suggesting communities that knew they were running out of time. In the ruins of medieval European towns, they discover caches of valuable objects hidden in ways that indicate desperate hope for eventual return. In the scattered remains of modern flood zones, they document the same patterns of hurried preservation and reluctant abandonment. What makes these patterns archaeologically significant is how they illuminate the human experience of living with flood risk. Ancient peoples weren't passive victims of natural forces. They were active agents who made complex decisions about how to balance normal life against the constant possibility of catastrophe. The archaeological record preserves evidence of these decisions in the form of architectural choices, settlement patterns, and material culture distributions. In the Mesopotamian city of Sippar, archaeologists have uncovered a remarkable sequence of flood preparations spanning several centuries. The site shows evidence of increasingly sophisticated attempts to protect the city's temple complex from recurring river floods. Early phases show simple earthen embankments. Later phases reveal elaborate stone-lined channels designed to divert floodwaters away from sacred buildings. The final phase shows evidence of a massive construction project that raised the entire temple precinct, several meters above the surrounding city. The sequence documents a community that learned from each flood experience, applying accumulated knowledge to increasingly ambitious engineering projects. But it also shows the limits of such learning. The final archaeological layer contains flood deposits that overwhelmed even the most sophisticated defenses, burying the raised temple complex under meters of river-borne sediment. The Sippar sequence illustrates something profound about the relationship between human knowledge and natural forces. Communities can learn, adapt, and improve their responses to environmental challenges. But the forces they're responding to don't remain constant. Rivers change course. Climate patterns shift. Geological conditions evolve. The very success of human adaptations can create new vulnerabilities that weren't present when the original solutions were developed. This dynamic appears repeatedly in the archaeological record of flood disasters. At Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, researchers have documented at least 7 distinct phases of urban reconstruction, each representing recovery from flooding that destroyed the previous iteration of the city. The architectural evolution shows increasingly sophisticated water management, with later phases featuring more elaborate drainage systems and higher building foundations. But the final abandonment of Mohenjo-Daro suggests that even this accumulated expertise wasn't sufficient when environmental conditions shifted beyond the parameters of existing knowledge. The archaeological evidence points to a period when the river system that had sustained the city for centuries began behaving in fundamentally different ways, creating flood patterns that existing infrastructure couldn't handle. The preservation of these learning sequences in the archaeological record creates a unique form of documentation. Unlike written histories, which tend to focus on exceptional events and elite activities, the archaeological record of flood disasters captures the accumulated experience of entire communities, responding to environmental challenges over multiple generations. In the stratified deposits of flood-prone sites, archaeologists can trace the development of local knowledge systems that aren't recorded in any text or preserved in any oral tradition. The evolution of house foundation techniques, the refinement of drainage system designs, the development of flood-resistant storage methods. These represent forms of collective intelligence that were embedded in material culture rather than preserved in language. But the archaeological record also documents the fragility of such embedded knowledge. When flood disasters disrupted the continuity of community life, the practical wisdom accumulated over generations could be lost as completely as the physical structures it was designed to protect. Survivors who relocated to new environments often couldn't apply their flood management expertise to different geological and hydrological conditions. This problem of knowledge transfer appears with particular clarity in the archaeological record of the American Southwest. Sites like those in Chaco Canyon show evidence of sophisticated water management systems that enabled complex societies to thrive in arid environments for centuries. But when climatic conditions changed, making existing water management strategies inadequate, the accumulated knowledge couldn't be successfully adapted to new circumstances. The archaeological evidence suggests that the communities didn't simply abandon their settlements because of water shortage. They appear to have attempted increasingly desperate modifications to their water management systems, creating archaeological signatures of engineering experiments that ultimately failed to address changed environmental conditions. The final phases of occupation show evidence of social stress that appears in the archaeological record as changes in settlement patterns, architectural styles, and material culture distributions. Communities that had been integrated into regional networks became increasingly isolated. Elaborate ceremonial sites were abandoned in favor of defensive positions. The archaeological markers of social complexity gave way to patterns associated with smaller, more mobile groups. This sequence of social simplification in response to environmental stress appears at flood-affected sites across the globe. In the Eastern Mediterranean, archaeological sites from the Late Bronze Age show similar patterns of increasing isolation and defensive posturing that coincide with evidence of climatic instability and increased flooding. The archaeological record suggests that communities facing environmental stress often responded by prioritizing immediate survival over long-term cultural development. Resources that might have been invested in monumental architecture, artistic production, or technological innovation were redirected toward more basic survival needs. The result was a kind of cultural triage that preserved essential functions while sacrificing aspects of human flourishing that required stable environmental conditions. But the archaeological record also preserves evidence of communities that managed to maintain cultural complexity despite environmental challenges. These sites show different patterns of adaptation, often involving increased investment in technologies and social institutions that enhanced resilience rather than simply improving defensive capabilities. At the ancient city of Çatalhöyük in Turkey, archaeologists have found evidence of a community that maintained cultural sophistication for over 1,000 years, despite recurring environmental challenges, including periodic flooding. The site shows continuous architectural innovation, elaborate artistic traditions, and complex ritual practices that persisted through multiple episodes of environmental stress. The key, appears to have been flexibility rather than resistance. Instead of building increasingly elaborate defences against flooding, the Çatalhöyük community developed architectural and social systems that could accommodate periodic inundation without losing essential functions. Houses were designed to be easily rebuilt. Valuable objects were stored in ways that enabled rapid evacuation. Social institutions were structured to maintain cohesion even when physical infrastructure was disrupted. The archaeological record documents this flexibility in the form of architectural features that seem designed for disassembly and reconstruction, storage systems that prioritized portability over security, artistic traditions that emphasized easily transportable objects rather than permanent installations. These represent a different philosophy of environmental adaptation, one that accepted the inevitability of periodic disruption rather than attempting to prevent it entirely. This adaptive flexibility appears in various forms at archaeological sites that show evidence of successful long-term occupation despite flood risk. In some cases, communities developed seasonal movement patterns that enabled them to take advantage of flood-prone areas during dry periods while relocating to higher ground when waters rose. In others, they created distributed settlement systems where essential functions were spread across multiple sites, ensuring that no single flood event could disable the entire community. The archaeological evidence for these adaptive strategies is often subtle, appearing in the form of architectural details, artifact distributions, and settlement patterns that might seem unremarkable unless interpreted in the context of environmental risk. But when viewed as integrated systems, they reveal sophisticated approaches to flood risk management that prioritized resilience over resistance. These ancient strategies have contemporary relevance as modern communities grapple with flood risks that may exceed the capacity of traditional engineering approaches. The archaeological record suggests that the most successful long-term adaptations to flood risk may involve fundamental changes in how communities organize themselves spatially, socially, and economically, rather than simply building higher walls or deeper channels. But implementing such changes requires forms of collective decision-making and long-term planning that can be difficult to achieve in modern political and economic systems. The archaeological record shows that successful adaptive strategies often developed over multiple generations, with each community building on the experiences of their predecessors in ways that created accumulated wisdom about living with environmental uncertainty. Modern societies, with their emphasis on rapid economic growth and short-term planning horizons, may find it challenging to develop the kind of patient, multi-generational approach to environmental adaptation that the archaeological record suggests was characteristic of successfully resilient ancient communities. The archaeological evidence also reveals the importance of maintaining cultural practices and social institutions that can function effectively during and after environmental disasters. Communities that survived major flood events often possessed strong traditions of mutual aid, flexible leadership structures, and cultural narratives that provided meaning and hope in the face of catastrophic loss. These social and cultural resources don't preserve as clearly in the archaeological record as physical infrastructure, but they appear in indirect forms that careful analysis can detect. Patterns of resource sharing that suggest communal rather than individual responses to scarcity. Architectural arrangements that facilitate collective decision-making. Artistic and ritual traditions that emphasize community cohesion and shared identity. In the post-flood layers at many archaeological sites, researchers find evidence of rapid reconstruction that could only have been accomplished through coordinated community effort. Buildings erected using standardized techniques that suggest shared knowledge and organized labor. Infrastructure projects that required collective planning and resource allocation. These archaeological signatures point to social institutions that remained functional even after physical infrastructure was destroyed. The contrast is stark, with sites that show evidence of social breakdown following flood disasters. At these locations, post-flood layers often contain evidence of individual rather than collective responses to reconstruction needs. scattered building efforts using non-standardized techniques, defensive installations that suggest conflict over resources, evidence of abandonment by portions of the population who couldn't or wouldn't participate in collective recovery efforts. The archaeological record suggests that the social and cultural dimensions of flood resilience may be more important than the purely technical aspects. Communities with strong social institutions could often recover from physical destruction that would have permanently disabled communities with weaker social cohesion. This insight has profound implications for how modern communities prepare for and respond to flood disasters. While technological solutions like improved early warning systems and flood control infrastructure are undoubtedly important, the archaeological record suggests that investments in social capital and community resilience may be equally crucial for long-term survival and recovery. The challenge is that social resilience is harder to quantify and plan for than physical infrastructure. Building a seawall requires engineering expertise and construction resources, but building community cohesion requires sustained attention to social relationships, cultural practices, and institutional development that may take generations to mature. The archaeological record provides examples of both successful and unsuccessful approaches to building such social resilience. But translating these lessons into contemporary contexts requires careful attention to the specific social, economic, and political conditions that shape modern community life. As we examine the archaeological evidence for how different types of communities have responded to flood disasters throughout history, certain patterns emerge that transcend specific cultural and technological contexts. Communities that maintained diversity in their survival strategies, that preserved flexibility in their social and economic arrangements, and that invested in cultural practices that could provide meaning and cohesion during times of crisis, showed greater capacity for recovery from catastrophic flooding. But the archaeological record also reveals the inherent tension between the kind of investment in long-term resilience that enables survival of catastrophic events and the kind of intensive resource exploitation that enables rapid economic growth and cultural elaboration during stable periods. Many of the most spectacular archaeological sites, the ones that capture our imagination with their monumental architecture and sophisticated artistic traditions, represent communities that chose to invest heavily in immediate cultural achievement rather than long-term environmental adaptation. These communities created magnificent civilizations that enriched human culture immeasurably, but they also created vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to complete erasure when environmental conditions shifted. The archaeological record doesn't suggest that either strategy is inherently superior. Both approaches contributed essential elements to human cultural development. The tension between them appears to be a fundamental characteristic of how human societies respond to environmental uncertainty, with different communities making different choices based on their particular circumstances and values. What the archaeological record does suggest is that awareness of this tension and conscious choice about how to balance immediate achievement against long-term resilience may be crucial for communities facing significant environmental challenges. The flood disasters preserved in archaeological sites across the globe remind us that human civilization has always existed in relationship to forces larger than our immediate control. The communities that left the most impressive archaeological remains were often those that pushed the boundaries of what was possible within their environmental constraints. But the communities that survived the longest were often those that accepted those constraints and built their societies around sustainable relationships with environmental forces. As contemporary societies confront the possibility of environmental changes that could be more dramatic and more rapid than anything preserved in the historical or archaeological record, these ancient lessons take on new urgency. The patient accumulation of evidence in archaeological sites around the world provides a deep time perspective on human resilience and vulnerability that may be essential for navigating an uncertain future. The excavation continues. In research laboratories around the world, archaeologists are still analyzing flood deposits, still mapping the distribution of artifacts in disaster layers, still piecing together the stories of communities that faced the ultimate test of environmental catastrophe. Each new discovery adds another piece to our understanding of how human societies have navigated the relationship between cultural achievement and environmental sustainability. The silence of flood sites speaks across millennia, carrying lessons from communities that no longer exist to communities that are still learning how to live with water. In that silence, preserved in layers of sediment and scattered fragments of human creation, lies evidence of both our vulnerability and our resilience, both our capacity for magnificent achievement and our need for humble adaptation to forces beyond our control. The archaeological record of flood disasters doesn't provide simple answers to contemporary challenges, but it does provide something equally valuable: perspective on the deep patterns that have shaped human responses to environmental crisis throughout our long history on this planet. In that perspective, we may find guidance for writing the next chapter of the human story, one that honors both our achievements and our limitations, as we continue to build civilizations in a world where floods will always be possible. Tonight, as we draw closer to the end of our journey through these drowned worlds, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a profound recognition. The archaeological evidence we've traced across continents and centuries reveals something unsettling about the nature of human memory itself. When catastrophic floods erase civilizations, they don't just destroy buildings and kill people. They sever the threads of continuity that connect past to present, leaving gaps in human understanding that may never be fully bridged. In the flooded caves of the Dordogne Valley in France, researchers have discovered something remarkable. Paleolithic cave paintings, some of the oldest known human art, show clear evidence of water damage from ancient flood events. The pigments have been altered by submersion, creating ghostly impressions where vibrant images once decorated the cave walls. But what's most haunting isn't the damage itself, it's what the damage reveals about the fragility of human expression. These aren't just damaged paintings. They're evidence of moments when rising waters entered sacred spaces, transforming galleries of human creativity into underwater tombs. The archaeological record shows that some caves were flooded multiple times, with each inundation erasing portions of the artistic record, while preserving others in ways that create a palimpsest of human memory, layered and incomplete. The cave flood deposits contain more than just damaged art. Mixed with the sediments are stone tools, bone implements, and organic materials that speak to the sudden abandonment of spaces that had been used by humans for thousands of years. The archaeological evidence suggests that these weren't gradual abandonments, but emergency evacuations where people had to choose between their possessions and their lives. What makes these cave flood sites so archaeologically significant is how they demonstrate the vulnerability of human cultural transmission. The paintings and engravings in these caves weren't just decorations. They were repositories of cultural knowledge, maps of spiritual significance, teaching tools that encoded essential information about how to survive in challenging environments. When floods damaged or destroyed these cultural archives, entire ways of understanding the world may have been lost. The pattern appears in archaeological sites across Europe, where limestone caves and rock shelters show evidence of flood damage to prehistoric art. In Spain, the caves of Altamira contain flood deposits that have partially obscured some of the most sophisticated Paleolithic paintings ever discovered. In Italy, flooded caves near the Mediterranean coast reveal evidence of artistic traditions that were interrupted by rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. Each of these sites tells a similar story. Human communities invested enormous effort in creating permanent records of their knowledge and beliefs, only to see those records damaged or destroyed by forces beyond their control. The floods that entered these sacred spaces didn't just cause physical damage. They disrupted the cultural practices that gave meaning to the art, severing the connection between symbol and significance that made the images comprehensible to their creators. Moving forward in time, we encounter similar patterns in the archaeological record of literate civilizations. The Great Library of Alexandria, one of the ancient world's most important repositories of human knowledge, was damaged by flooding from the Nile Delta on multiple occasions. While the library's destruction is often attributed to fire or deliberate sabotage, recent archaeological investigations have revealed evidence of flood damage that may have been equally devastating to the collection. Papyrus fragments recovered from flood deposits near the library site show the distinctive damage patterns created when organic writing materials are submerged and then dried. The inks run, the fibers separate, the text becomes illegible. But the fragments also reveal something remarkable about ancient preservation efforts. Some show evidence of careful copying before the originals were damaged, suggesting scribes who understood the vulnerability of their materials and worked systematically to preserve knowledge against the possibility of future disasters. The Alexandria flood deposits contain more than just damaged manuscripts. They include seals, writing implements, and architectural fragments that provide evidence of the library's physical organization and working methods. The archaeological record suggests a sophisticated institution with multiple copying centers, distributed storage systems, and procedures for protecting valuable materials during flood seasons. But even these precautions weren't sufficient when exceptional floods exceeded the capacity of existing protection measures. The archaeological layers show evidence of sudden inundation that overwhelmed storage areas and workspaces, mixing precious manuscripts with flood debris in ways that made recovery impossible. The loss wasn't just of individual texts, but of entire intellectual traditions. The library contained works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. When floods destroyed these unique copies, the knowledge they contained vanished permanently from human culture, leaving gaps in our understanding that we're still discovering centuries later. This pattern of knowledge loss appears repeatedly in the archaeological record of flood disasters. At the ancient city of Mari in Syria, cuneiform tablets recovered from flood deposits reveal the existence of sophisticated legal, commercial, and literary traditions that were completely unknown until their accidental preservation in disaster contexts. The tablets show evidence of a literate culture with complex administrative systems and extensive trade networks. Yet this civilization left no other trace in the historical record. The Mari tablets demonstrate something profound about the relationship between archaeological preservation and historical knowledge. The flood that destroyed the city also created the anaerobic conditions that preserved its written records. Without the disaster, we would never have known that such sophisticated civilizations existed in regions we had assumed were sparsely populated during these time periods. But the preservation is also fragmentary and accidental. The floodwaters scattered documents randomly, mixing official records with personal letters, religious texts with commercial contracts. The result is a partial picture that tantalizes with glimpses of complete cultural systems, while reminding us how much has been lost. In China, similar patterns appear at sites along the Yellow River, where flood deposits have preserved fragments of literary and philosophical works that don't appear in the official canon of Chinese literature. These aren't copies of known texts, but evidence of intellectual traditions that developed independently in regional centers before being destroyed by catastrophic flooding. The Chinese flood sites reveal something particularly important about how natural disasters interact with processes of cultural selection. The texts that survived to be copied and transmitted by later generations were often those that existed in major urban centers with extensive scribal networks. Works that existed only in smaller communities or regional centers were more vulnerable to complete loss when local disasters destroyed their only copies. The archaeological record suggests that what we consider the classical traditions of ancient civilizations may represent only a fraction of the intellectual achievement that actually existed. Flood disasters eliminated entire schools of thought, philosophical traditions to human cultural development if they had survived to, and artistic movements that might have contributed significantly influence later generations. This selective preservation appears with particular clarity in the archaeological record of the Maya civilization. The Spanish conquest resulted in the deliberate destruction of most Maya books, but flood sites have preserved fragments of codices that reveal intellectual traditions unknown from the surviving documents. These fragments show evidence of mathematical, astronomical, and calendrical knowledge that exceeds what appears in the famous Dresden, Paris, and Madrid codices. The flood-preserved Maya texts also reveal something important about the relationship between elite and popular culture in ancient civilizations. The officially preserved codices tend to focus on royal genealogies, religious ceremonies, and state-sponsored activities. But the flood-damaged fragments include evidence of popular literature, folk knowledge, and local traditions that provide a more complete picture of Maya intellectual life. The archaeological evidence suggests that flood disasters often had democratizing effects on cultural preservation, preserving popular materials that wouldn't normally have been considered worthy of official preservation, while destroying elite archives that were concentrated in vulnerable locations. This pattern has contemporary relevance, as digital technologies create new forms of vulnerability to disaster-related knowledge loss. Modern information systems are often more centralized and more fragile than the distributed manuscript traditions they've replaced. A single flood event that destroys a server facility can eliminate digital collections that took decades to assemble. But digital technologies also create new possibilities for distributed preservation that appear in the archaeological record as improvements in disaster resilience. Communities that maintain multiple copies of essential information in different locations show greater capacity for cultural continuity after catastrophic events. The archaeological record of flood disasters reveals recurring cycles of knowledge creation, preservation, loss, and reconstruction that have shaped human intellectual development throughout history. Each major flood event created discontinuities in cultural transmission that forced survivors to reconstruct their understanding of the world from fragmentary evidence. But the same archaeological record also documents remarkable human capacity for intellectual recovery. Communities that lost their libraries and schools often managed to rebuild their knowledge systems within generations, sometimes achieving levels of sophistication that exceeded what existed before the disaster. The key appears to have been maintaining oral traditions and practical skills that could survive the destruction of written records. Archaeological sites show evidence of communities that preserved essential knowledge through storytelling, craft traditions, and ritual practices that didn't depend on permanent installations or written documentation. These oral preservation systems show up in the archaeological record as continuities in material culture, architectural techniques, and artistic styles that persist across flood events even when written records are lost. The evidence suggests that successful knowledge preservation required hybrid systems that combined written documentation with oral transmission and practical demonstration. Modern societies, with their heavy dependence on written and digital information systems, may be more vulnerable to knowledge loss from flood disasters than communities that maintained stronger oral traditions. The archaeological record suggests that resilient knowledge systems require redundancy across different preservation methods rather than relying entirely on any single approach. As we consider the implications of this archaeological evidence for contemporary flood risk, the patterns become deeply relevant. Climate change may increase the frequency and severity of flood disasters that threaten not just physical infrastructure, but the information systems that preserve human knowledge and cultural achievement. The archaeological record suggests that successful adaptation to increased flood risk may require fundamental changes in how we organize and preserve knowledge, moving toward more distributed, more redundant, and more flexible systems that can maintain function even when centralized facilities are disrupted. But such changes also require cultural shifts that may be difficult to achieve in societies organized around efficiency and specialization rather than resilience and redundancy. The archaeological evidence shows that the most flood-resilient communities were often those that accepted lower levels of economic efficiency in exchange for greater survival capacity during crisis periods. The tension between efficiency and resilience appears throughout the archaeological record of flood disasters. Communities that optimized their systems for normal conditions often created vulnerabilities that became catastrophic when conditions exceeded normal parameters. Communities that maintained seemingly inefficient redundancies often survived disasters that destroyed more streamlined societies. This pattern has profound implications for how contemporary societies prepare for uncertain environmental futures. The archaeological record suggests that true resilience may require accepting apparent inefficiencies in exchange for survival capacity that only becomes valuable during extreme events. As our journey through these archaeological landscapes of flood disaster draws toward its close, we find ourselves confronting questions that extend far beyond historical curiosity. The evidence preserved in sediment layers and scattered artifacts speaks directly to challenges facing contemporary civilization as environmental conditions become increasingly unpredictable. The communities whose stories we've traced through the archaeological record faced flood disasters within relatively stable global environmental conditions. The catastrophes that erased their cities were often local or regional events that didn't fundamentally alter the broader context within which human civilization developed. Contemporary flood risks may unfold against the backdrop of systematic environmental changes that could affect the entire planet simultaneously. The archaeological record provides guidance for how communities have successfully adapted to local flood disasters, but it offers less direct precedent for how global civilization might respond to planetary-scale environmental disruption. Yet the deep patterns preserved in archaeological sites remain relevant. The evidence shows that successful adaptation to environmental uncertainty requires flexibility, redundancy, and acceptance of the fundamental vulnerability that defines the human condition. Communities that acknowledge their limitations and built their societies around sustainable relationships with natural forces showed greater long-term survival capacity than communities that believed their technologies could overcome environmental constraints. The silence that follows catastrophic flooding carries lessons across the millennia. In that silence, preserved in layers of sediment and fragments of human creation, we find evidence of both our capacity for magnificent achievement and our need for humble recognition of forces beyond our control. The archaeological excavation continues. In laboratories and research stations around the world, scientists are still analyzing flood deposits, still mapping the distribution of artifacts in disaster layers, still piecing together stories of communities that face the ultimate test of environmental catastrophe. Each discovery adds another piece to our understanding of how human societies navigate the relationship between cultural ambition and environmental reality. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, carry with you the voices of these drowned worlds. The pottery maker whose wheel still spins beneath the floodplain. The scribe whose half-finished letter remains pressed between layers of clay. The child whose toy boat floats forever in the sediment of a city that vanished when the waters rose. Their stories remind us that every human achievement exists in negotiation with forces larger than our immediate understanding. Every city we build, every knowledge we preserve, every future we imagine, all exist within the patient rhythms of water and time that have shaped human experience since our ancestors first built shelters beside rivers that could both sustain and destroy them. The great floods that erased cities worldwide were not just disasters. They were teachers, reminders of the conditions under which all human civilization unfolds. In learning to read their lessons preserved in the archaeological record, we learn something essential about what it means to be human in a world where permanence is always provisional and where our greatest achievements arise from our willingness to build beautiful, fragile things, despite knowing they cannot last forever. Sleep now, and dream of cities rising from the water, of knowledge preserved in unexpected places, of human communities that learn to thrive not by conquering the forces of nature, but by dancing with them in the endless choreography of creation and destruction that defines life on this blue planet, where water covers most of the surface, and memory flows like rivers toward the sea. As we reach the end of our journey through these drowned worlds, a profound truth emerges from the archaeological silence. Every civilization that has ever risen beside rivers or seas has written the same story in different languages. They build, they flourish, they believe their walls can hold back the inevitable. Then the water comes, patient and absolute, erasing everything except the lessons embedded in sediment and stone. The archaeological record doesn't lie. From Mesopotamian floodplains to the depths of the Black Sea, from the buried streets of Kaifeng to the submerged harbours of the Mediterranean, the evidence whispers the same haunting refrain. Human achievement, no matter how magnificent, exists in constant negotiation with forces that dwarf our understanding. The floods that erased cities worldwide weren't anomalies. They were reminders of the fundamental conditions under which all human civilization unfolds. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, carry with you the voices of these lost worlds. The merchant whose ledger remains half-written beneath 20 feet of silt. The child whose clay doll still rests where it was dropped as families fled rising waters. The engineer whose sophisticated drainage systems became rivers of destruction when nature decided the rules had changed. Their stories live on in the patient accumulation of archaeological evidence, teaching us that permanence is always provisional, that our greatest achievements arise not from conquering natural forces, but from learning to dance with them. The excavation continues. In laboratories around the world, archaeologists are still brushing sediment from artifacts that haven't seen daylight for millennia, still mapping the distribution of human dreams preserved in disaster layers. Each discovery adds another fragment to our understanding of what water can erase and what human ingenuity manages to preserve across the vast scales of geological time. Sleep now and dream of the cities that rise and fall like tides, of knowledge scattered and gathered, of communities that learned the most essential lesson the earth has to teach. That in a world where water covers most of the surface, we build our greatest monuments, not in stone or steel, but in the stories we pass down about what it means to be human when the floods inevitably come.